The sphenoid bone lies at the middle part of the base of the skull. So the sphenoid bone is pretty centrally located in the skull. It forms the bottom portion of the cranial cavity, or the inferior portion of the cranial cavity. It also extends out a little bit to the lateral side of the skull, and it forms a portion of the orbits. The sphenoid bone is often referred to as the keystone of the cranial floor. The reason being it articulates, it forms joints with all other cranial bones. So a keystone refers to keystone in the world of architecture. So buildings with doorways often have a keystone at the top of the doorway. And if that keystone is removed, the entire doorway falls apart. So what happens is this bone kind of holds the entire cranial cavity together by articulating with all these other cranial bones. The sphenoid bone therefore articulates with the frontal bone, which we've learned, the temporal bones, the parietal bones, the occipital bone, and this bone here, which we haven't learned yet, is called the ethmoid bone, which also forms just a small portion of the cranial floor. One significant structure on the sphenoid bone is known as the sella turcica. Sella turcica actually means Turkish saddle. It looks like a saddle that you would put on a horse. Maybe not at this view, but when we look at a mid-sagittal view, you'll note this saddle-like shape. This saddle doesn't hold a person or anything. It holds your pituitary gland. So your pituitary gland projects down from your brain and is nicely protected within the sella turcica. Looking anteriorly, again, we can see that the sphenoid bone does form portions of the orbits. It also forms a couple slits in the back of the orbits called orbital fissures. This one here is referred to the superior orbital fissure because it angles upward. This one here is the inferior orbital fissure. Those fissures are for nerves to reach the muscles that control your eye movements. There's a third opening in the sphenoid bone known as the optic foramen. The optic foramen is more like a round hole than a slit, so it is known as a foramen as opposed to a fissure. And this one is for the optic nerve. So this hole is just so that optic nerve that transmits your sense of vision from the eye into the brain. So looking at the back of the orbit, you can note two fissures and one foramen. This is that mid-sagittal look that shows the sphenoid bone, again, kind of centrally located in the skull, forming the inferior kind of floor of the cranial cavity. And you can see right about here is the saddle, the sella turcica. And you can see here would be this place that the pituitary gland would be protected, the sella turcica. The sphenoid bone also has some sinuses, paranasal sinuses. We previously mentioned the frontal sinus, and when you cut through the frontal bone, you can see that sinus located within it. The sphenoid bone has many little sinuses within it as well. This is a disarticulated sphenoid bone, so this is if we were to remove the sphenoid bone from the skull and just look at it on its own. You probably noticed that the sphenoid bone kind of looks like a bat. Some people kind of call it the bat-shaped bone, or I believe your book references more it as a butterfly-shaped bone. But it actually does have wings. They actually call these structures the lesser wings, and this structure here the greater wing. You can notice that there are sphenoidal sinuses. Again, looking at this view, there's a few processes that stick down from it called pterygoid processes. But this bone is very irregular. No other bone looks like the sphenoid bone. The next one is called the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is also one you don't hear too much about. It's buried pretty deep in the skull. Its location is kind of the anterior portion of the cranial floor, but also it forms much of the structures found within the nasal cavity. The ethmoid bone has a structure very distinctive known as the crista galli, and crista galli actually means crest of the rooster. And that little crest that projects up into the cranial cavity is for your meninges to attach to. So meninges are membranes that surround and protect your brain. And those meninges attach to that crista galli. So that's a major structure located on the sphenoid bone. Behind the crista galli, there's what's called the cribriform plate. So if you look at this mid-sagittal view, there's a little plate here. It actually forms much of your superior nasal cavity. So here's a nasal cavity, and it forms kind of the ceiling or the upper part of the nasal cavity. And it has small little holes in it. And those small little holes are known as olfactory foramina. Foramina is plural for foramen. So there are many little holes in that cribriform plate. Those holes are for your olfactory neurons, which are stimulated by odor, and those neurons need to go up into the brain so you can perceive those odors. So there needs to be little tiny holes so the neurons can gain access to the larger nerve called the olfactory nerve. Lastly, the ethmoid bone has what's known as nasal concha. Nasal concha project into the nasal cavity. These are also often called turbinates, and what these structures do is they increase the surface area in the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity has a high surface area in order to properly humidify the air, so these are all covered with mucous membranes that will add moisture to the air that you breathe in. They're also there to help filter out any particulates that you breathe in, and they also help warm the air as it travels through the nasal cavity. There's actually 3 pairs of nasal concha. There's superior, middle, and inferior. But notice the inferior nasal concha is not part of the ethmoid bone. So the ethmoid bone is shaded in a little darker here. It has the superior and middle nasal concha. The inferior is actually a completely separate bone, known as the inferior nasal concha. So those are the nasal concha projecting into the nasal cavity. There is one last structure called the perpendicular plate. The perpendicular plate runs vertically down from the ethmoid bone and forms the superior portion of your nasal septum. Your nasal septum is what divides your nasal cavity into 2 cavities, a right and left nasal cavity. That nasal septum has bone as well as cartilage components. The superior bony portion is called the perpendicular plate. The inferior bony section is a bone called the vomer, which is technically a facial bone. So we will revisit that when we get to facial bones. So the ethmoid bone has a lot of structures on it. Notice over here The disarticulated ethmoid bone is another one of these very irregularly shaped bones. It also has ethmoidal sinuses. So it now is our third bone that has paranasal sinuses. So we have frontal sinus, which would be located up here. We have sphenoidal sinuses as well as ethmoidal sinuses. Then when we get to the maxillae, we'll see that there are maxillary sinuses located in this area and this area. So that's the sphenoid bone and ethmoid bone. Both irregular shaped bones, both having a lot of structures to them.